All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a refreshing, lovely 10 minutes. But let's jump right back into it. So next up, we have our second distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Nicholas Ryhorczyk. He is an academic director of online learning at Morton College. And today he will be presenting on Chernobyl Revisited, Nuclear Power and the War in Ukraine. Take it away, Dr. Ryhorczyk.
Thank you. Yes, let me share my screen here. Can you guys see that? Wonderful. First, I want to thank the GEH Lab for the invitation to speak. It's a real honor. Also to present with my fellow speakers. It's a privilege to speak alongside you. And a special thanks to Dr. Tomoyuki Shibata, who, in addition to being a, I would say, global visionary and prolific researcher, I want to personally thank for his support in Ukraine. So thank you, Shiba. My title is Chernobyl Revisited, Nuclear Power and the War in Ukraine. Just a little bit more about myself. My MA and PhD is from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I led biannual workshops on research methodologies and new technology. I was a member for the Collaborative for Cultural Heritage Management and Policy, a teaching mentor to international faculty on interdisciplinary collaboration and professional conduct. I have a certificate in Foundations of Teaching, certificate in Business Culture, and I was a former FLAS Fellow. In addition to my current role as the academic director of online learning at Morton College, I've worked at the Shanghai Business School, I've worked at Northern Illinois University, and I've worked at Horizon Capital as well, which is a private equity fund manager that originates and manages investments in mid-cap companies with outstanding growth and profit potential in Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. Oh, there we are. So my initial work on Chernobyl focused on two key questions, and that is, does Chernobyl have a universally valuable heritage in the context of a dark tourism site that people will want to experience? The second big question that was asked was, does that value warrant UNESCO's attention and possible consideration for future enlistment on the World Heritage List? UNESCO World Heritage Sites from the UNESCO World Heritage Convention in 1972 states that a World Heritage Site must furnish proof of outstanding universal value for all humanity. In order to meet this threshold, a site must meet one or more of the following criteria. Before I continue, just want to make sure you guys can hear me okay, and I'm not going too fast. Yep, great. So criteria include representing a masterpiece of human or creative genius, exhibits an important interchange of human values, bears unique or exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or to a civilization, is an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural or technological ensemble, is an outstanding example of a traditional human settlement, is directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, contains superlative natural phenomena or areas of exceptional natural beauty, is an outstanding example representing major stages of Earth's history, is an outstanding example representing significant ongoing ecological and biological processes, contains the most important and significant natural habitats for insight conservation of biological diversity. The implications for Chernobyl, had it gotten a designation as a UNESCO Heritage Site, would pose strict international requirements on the Ukrainian government for preservation of the site and for making it conducive to large-scale tourism. The international recognition of Chernobyl's universal heritage would transform its current global perception from that of a nuclear wasteland into an important lesson for mankind and a site worth visiting. And what I was really looking at is that if we think about UNESCO World Heritage Sites, they focus on positive things. And in my view, as humanity, we learn much more from our mistakes, from our failures. UNESCO has made some exceptions to the rule for enlistment, which include Auschwitz and Hiroshima, the dome. And I felt that consideration should be granted to Chernobyl as a reminder to humanity of man's reliance on what is increasingly very dangerous technology. So this came from Radio Moscow on April 28th, 1986. An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the atomic reactors has been damaged. Measures are being undertaken to liquidate the consequences of the accident. Those affected are being given aid, and a government commission has been created. Here's a view of Chernobyl, the western borderland of what used to be the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's 133 kilometers north of Ukraine's capital city of Kyiv. The Chernobyl region, we also call it Polisia, was not well suited for agricultural cultivation. Of course, Ukraine is known for having great soil for agriculture. However, this area is not great for that. In October 1977 is when the first power block came on stream. If we think about the date of the accident, it shows you how quickly this accident happened. Root causes of the accident, really there's two. We have design flaws. There was no external containment of Chernobyl, and they used graphite as a moderator. Graphite as a moderator is problematic because it's highly flammable. We also have human error. They ran a safety experiment on April 26, 1986. Here's what that reactor looks like from the inside. We have control rods, a radiation shield and containment structure, steam separator, the steam, the water, but again, very importantly, you can see those graphite moderators. This is the RBMK reactor design. It is not the design of the plants that are currently under threat in Ukraine, which are VVER reactors. Here's a view of the accident. There was an overwhelming power surge, about 100 times the normal output, that resulted in a steam explosion, a hydrogen gas explosion, and then of course, the graphite catches fire. Acute health effects, there were 31 deaths, 2 immediate, one as a result of the explosion, one as a result of coronary thrombosis. One person died early in the morning from thermal burns, and 28 died later in treatment centers from acute radiation syndrome. And here's a view of one of them. There was an evacuation on April 27, 1986 at 2 p.m. About 1,200 buses arrived to evacuate the citizens of Pripyat, located 4 kilometers from the plant. Pripyat is where the folks lived. Everybody that was working there lived in Pripyat. It was considered a modern Soviet city. The average age was in the 20s, and it was experiencing at the time a baby boom. The military went on to establish a 30-kilometer radius from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, designated for complete and permanent evacuation. I'm often asked about people in the zone. This is exclusionary zone, as we call it, and there are some folks that do live there. However, they are very old, and they kind of pretend that the government doesn't know that they're there, and the government pretends that they don't know that they're there, but they're essentially allowing them to live out their lives there. Here's a geographical deposition of radionuclides by day. So you can kind of see the shaded movement. Of course, a lot depends on the direction of the wind. For the graphite fire, they decided to lay lots of different types of materials. It was essentially a panic. So they dumped materials from April 28th to May 2nd, 40 tons of boron compounds, because it's a neutron absorber, 2,400 tons of lead, radiation absorber, 1,800 tons of sand and clay, 600 tons of dolomite for a heat sink and CO2 former, sodium phosphate and polymer liquids. It took about 1,800 helicopter flights to try to mitigate the disaster. The Chernobyl liquidators, really the heroes, they're military and civilian cleanup crew. They were workers brought in to liquidate the aftermath of the accident. Many of them did not know how dangerous this work was, and there was approximately 600,000 from throughout the former Soviet Union, just to highlight the levels of exposure here. Things that we look at and we're concerned with: radioiodine, gaseous fission products that form within fuel rods. So though it's quite dangerous, the half-life is only about 8 days. That's also why it's quite common after these accidents to get iodine pills, particularly to pregnant women, young children, essentially anyone under the age of 18. Radioiodine decays via beta particles and gamma radiation and concentrates in the thyroid gland. One of the things that we see is increased levels of thyroid cancer because it absorbs it quite readily. Radiocesium, formed by breakdown of uranium in fuel elements. Cesium-134 has a half-life of 2 years, but 137 has a half-life of roughly 30 years. That's a very, very long time. It decays to barium-137 by emitting beta particles. Barium decays by emitting gamma. I'm often asked about when can this area be resettled. I always like to say never, particularly where the reactor is. It'll likely burn forever, quite literally. And they've been measuring kind of the cesium still in the soil for the last 20 years or so. And it's actually breaking down slower than anticipated. And they're not exactly sure why, but I think that rough estimates say that we can't really consider building even in the exclusionary zone for another maybe 180 to 300 years. Here's a list of evacuated and resettled people. From Belarus from 86 to 90, we had about 24,000 people. In Russia, 3,400. In Ukraine, 91,000. Resettled people from 91 to 2000, another 111,000 from Belarus, 49,000 from Russia, 72,000 from Ukraine, 231,000, kind of total 350,000, let's say, evacuated and resettled people. A lot of people ask about that influx of resettlement from Belarus. Well, some of these health effects take time. And because the wind was blowing north, a lot of that fallout came down in Belarus. In terms of long-term health effects, between 86 and 2006, 4,369 cases of thyroid cancer were registered among children in Ukraine. Epidemiological studies of liquidators have also observed increased risk of leukemia and ocular cataracts. But perhaps the greatest health impact of the Chernobyl accident has been the psychological effects. But here's a slight graph, and you can see the huge jumps of thyroid cancer in children under 15 after the disaster. So when they built the reactor, they said nothing would ever happen. It would, this is a 1 in a million accident. This is the argument that is always made. But not long after, in the grand scheme of things, let's say 25 years later, on March 11th, 2011, an earthquake and subsequent tsunami hit the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan, leading to equipment failures, a probable nuclear meltdown, and the release of radioactive materials. So while the nuclear power industry has been resurrected by a lobbying campaign that has left many people believing it to be clean, green, emission-free alternative to fossil fuels, these disasters should make folks think twice. And as people like to say quite often, nuclear power is one hell of a way to boil water. In the spirit of sustainability, I thought I would include some work from one of my chapters, Evolution on Steroids. This is from the UNDP and UNICEF. says the international community should explore with the governments concerned the possibilities for promoting specialized ecological tourism and for maximizing the contribution that these areas can make to the preservation of international diversity. Little attempt had been made to exploit the reduction of human disturbance to the ecosystems and cultural landscape in a positive way, and the current national plans for biodiversity protection and cultural preservation hardly refer to this potential. The territories could be used to fulfill 3 countries' international obligations to the protection of biodiversity. Some 100 species that were on the International Union for Conservation of the Nature's Red List for threatened species can now be found in the evacuated zone. About 40 of these, including bears and wolves, were rarely seen in the zone before the accident. While there's widespread evidence of DNA damage in many species, of course, when I give talks, people like to joke about 3-headed catfish and things like that. But these mutations kind of get weeded out quite quickly, allowing the more robust survivors to thrive. So it's kind of provided a unique lab to study the effects of radiation exposure on ecosystems. So as ecologist James Morris of the University of South Carolina explains it, it's evolution on steroids. So perhaps one of the greatest lessons of all is that man and his activities, be it farming, fishing, hunting, habitat destruction, and now war, appear to be more harmful to the surrounding ecosystem than radiation. When you tour Chernobyl, the destruction you see is of the human environment. That's about probably the 12th floor of the Policia Hotel. And as you can see, there's a birch tree growing out of the floor. That brings us to today's kind of nuclear power landscape. In regards to nuclear power in Ukraine, there are 4 plants which prior to the war met around 50% of domestic electricity needs. And of course, Ukraine is home to the former Chernobyl NPP and exclusion zone. You can kind of see them there on the map. The areas most under threat now, of course, are in the southeast there, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant, which was also hit. Radiation risks. Of course, violent military takeover of nuclear power plants is a big risk. Instability of NPPs caused by electricity supply disruptions. We often talk about war and bombs and things like that, but one thing that we overlook quite often is that we need to keep these things cool. So a disruption to the electricity supply can be devastating. Of course, there's backups in place, but it can be very dangerous. Damage to storages of spent fuel and nuclear waste, damages to our research facilities, fires in contaminated areas. We have the Yukon coal mine and threatened use of tactical nuclear weapons. Here's Chernobyl NPP in the exclusion zone, which was occupied between February 24th and March 14th. You can see from the east, the Russian military camp that then came into Chernobyl. They interrupted the power supply and data transfer to IAEA. They stored ammunition there, mines, and there were wildfires and considerable looting. And if we look at the Russian military camp that's on the edge of the Red Forest there to the west, it shows you that these folks in the army probably had no idea of the danger that they were actually in. That's a highly contaminated area, the Red Forest. Here's an aerial view. This is from the Zoe Conflict and Environment Observatory of damage at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant there in the southeast. Here we have an ongoing occupation. We have shelling of buildings. We have an interruption to the power supply. There's the kidnapping of the director and deputy director, placement of heavy weapons on site, storage of ammunition, and IAEA sent inspectors. But again, just to highlight, kidnapping of the director and deputy director of the ZNPP plant. Here's a simulation from the Ukrainian Hydrometeorological Institute, and this was done August 15th to 18th of 2022, of a potential radiation release. So just to give you some perspective, going back to Chernobyl, which has about 2,000 fuel elements in reactor 4, the 6 reactors and waste storage of ZNPP have about 10 times that. The zone of radioactive contamination following the disaster at ZNPP would be 2 million kilometers, and 1 million people would be affected. Here you can see the simulation, the green going east, but then eventually moving west, again, dependent on the wind. But again, to highlight, this would be a much larger disaster than Chernobyl. So IAEA support and assistance mission came to Zaporizhia. They have 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety and security in Ukraine. Those include number 1, the physical integrity of the facilities. The safety and security systems are fully functional. The operating conditions for staff, the offsite power supply, the logistical chains, radiation monitoring and emergency response, reliable communications with the regulator. One thing that's not talked about quite as often on the news is the Unicum mine. The Unicum mine in Donetsk was the site of a controlled nuclear detonation in 1979 and is still filled with radioactive water. I'll go back to show you on the map where it is. If you look at Donetsk, all the way kind of east, you'll see the Unicum coal mine in 1979, which is currently under Russian occupation. The local authorities there halted the groundwater pumping, which allowed then that mine to flood. This has the potential for leaching of radioactive waste to the surface waters and the underground aquifers, a very dangerous situation. Here, we also had the missile strike near the South Ukraine nuclear power plant. I'll jump back once more. You'll see it. If you look at Odessa on the Black Sea and you go north, you'll see the South Ukraine nuclear power plant. On September 19th, the Russian army launched a missile attack on the site of the South Ukraine NPP. The explosion, this is an actual photo of that explosion, took place 300 meters from the reactors. And those shock waves, as a result, damaged some of the buildings, just to show you how close it came. Here are some updates. Energoatom, the Ukrainian state enterprise that operates the country's 4 nuclear power plants, said Russian forces have carried out secret construction work at the occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Russian officers controlling the area would not give access to Ukrainian staff running the plant or monitors from the UN's atomic energy watchdog just yesterday. It comes as fears rise that the Kremlin might intend to make Zaporizhia the site of its alleged false flag operation involving a nuclear device. You probably heard in the news a lot about what they call a dirty bomb. And that uses conventional explosives like dynamite to scatter radioactive waste in an effort to sow terror. It says that it assumes the Russians are preparing a terrorist act using nuclear materials and radioactive waste stored at the plant. There are about 174 containers at the plant's dry spent fuel storage facility, each containing 24 assemblies of spent nuclear fuel that could be used. Destruction of these containers as a result of an explosion will lead to a radiation accident and radiation contamination of the adjacent territory. We're at day 245 of the war. And since it began, we have over 7 million refugees now recorded in Europe. We have 8 million people that have been displaced. We have the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, verified a total of 6,374 civilian deaths during the invasion as of October 23rd, 2022, just a few days ago. 402 were children, 9,776 people were injured. And it's important to note that the real numbers could be and likely are considerably higher. Russian installed authorities in occupied Kherson have urged residents to leave immediately amid fighting with Ukrainian forces. Russia says its forces prevented an attempt by Ukraine to break through its line of control in the Kherson region, which anticipates a wider Ukrainian counteroffensive. Kherson is strategically very important to Ukraine, and the risk here is, if that counteroffensive continues to be successful, the risk of a tactical nuclear weapon or using a dirty bomb increases. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia's attacks on infrastructure were on a very wide scale and pledged his military would improve on an already good record of downing missiles with help from its partners. The group of 7 industrial powers condemned Russia's kidnapping of Ukrainian managers at the Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and called for the immediate return of full control of the plant to Ukraine. Japan's prime minister denounced Moscow's comments regarding the possible use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, saying the use of nuclear weapons was a serious threat to the peace and security, not only of Ukraine, but of the entire international community. Iran strongly condemned a call by Britain, France, and Germany for a United Nations probe of accusations that Russia has used Iranian-origin drones to attack Ukraine. The question that I get asked the most often is, how does this end? And I think probably the preeminent expert on this region is Timothy Snyder. And he said, at first, no one could imagine that the Russo-Ukrainian war could begin, and yet it began. And now no one can imagine how it will end, and end it will. War is ultimately about politics. That Ukraine is winning on the battlefield matters, because Ukraine is exerting pressure on Russian politics. Tyrants such as Putin exert a certain fascination because they give the impression that they can do what they like. This is not true, of course, and their regimes are deceptively brittle. The war ends when Ukrainian military victories alter Russian political realities, a process which I believe has begun. And I'll leave you with a poem from Boris Humenyuk. Boris Humenyuk came to rise with his poetry during the revolution of dignity. And I'll put his poem to the background of personal photos of mine from Chernobyl, because I think they ring true in 1986, in 2014, and in 2022. When you clean your weapon, when time and again you clean your weapon, when you rub strong smelling oils into your weapon and shield it from the rain with your own body, when you swaddle it like a baby, even though you've never swaddled a baby before, you're only 19, no baby, no wife. The weapon becomes your only kin. You and the weapon are one. When you dig trench after trench, when you dig this precious, this hateful earth by handfuls, every other handful reaches your soul. You grind this earth between your teeth. You never will have another. You climb into the earth like you climb into your mother's womb. You are warm and snug. You've never felt this close to anyone before. You and earth are one. When you shoot, even when it's at night and you don't see the enemy's face, even when night hides the enemy from you and you from the enemy, and embraces each of you as her own. You smell like gunpowder. Your hands, face, hair, clothing, shoes, no matter how much you wash them, smell of gunpowder. They smell of war. You smell of war. You and war are one. Thank you, Дякую, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Dr. Ryhorjic, for that very impactful and influential presentation. Now I want to open it up again for any questions.
I think two people raised hand earlier, Michelle and Rex-san. Or Mitchell. Sorry. I thought two students, not student, two participants, Mitchell and Rex, I think you raised a hand. Do you have any question?
I didn't raise my hand.
No, sure. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Hochok, I have a question, not actually a question, more like a comment under my thought. Like when you showed us that picture of Chernobyl, so exactly same thing happened in Japan, and then you talk about the 30 kilometer radiation evacuation. Japan did the same thing. Then I measure I measure radiation level surrounding those evacuation zone and no evacuation zone. We detected 10 times higher evacuation guideline of radiation level, because as you said, air, the wind transfer from south to north, like northwest. So those artificial evacuation zone doesn't work. So Japan didn't learn from Chernobyl, and then I was quite actually surprised that Ukraine had only 4 nuclear plants, but then United States had 54, and the 11 of them are in Illinois. Illinois is one of the states that has the largest number of nuclear power plant. So what do you think about the potential accident in US or Illinois?
I think it's incredibly scary. I think that we've seen already, despite kind of the push for cleaner energies and the push for nuclear power, we've had major accidents. We're at the risk of an even larger one now at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The plants in the US are quite old. Some are not in kind of good positions on fault lines and things like that. So the idea that nothing could happen here, I think, is false. It's something that certainly makes me quite nervous. And I know we don't have one on the coast of Florida, but just as an anecdote, if you will, my family is in Florida, and seeing that hurricane come through, I think, is a reminder that a lot of our weather patterns and such are changing, and it will continue to put the electrical grid and things like that at risk. So beyond a tsunami, for example, if we lose power for a considerable amount of time and we're not able to properly cool that material, it becomes incredibly dangerous.
Thank you so much.
If you don't mind me jumping in, I had some questions. And first of all, I'll say in Florida, there is or was Turkey Point down in near Miami. And I know they had quite a few issues, not just with the heating, but also intake of turtles and other less severe things. But I live in the state of Washington, and we have Hanford, well known to have a lot of issues with their containment of old barrels, buried barrels, and those effects are being felt by people downstream and in the areas of it. And so we also had the closure as a child. There was a closure of another plant. I can't think of the name. It's between the state of Washington and the state of Oregon that was closed for these reasons. And so my question's about political will in creating more power plants, nuclear power plants, perhaps if you have any insight in the US, but also globally. What is that political will to create more? Is it there with the leaders and the people, the voters? Are people really asking and clamoring for this, or is this a business thing that they're wanting more power plants or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think an argument can be made for business, but principally it's about this illusion of clean energy and the idea that these plants are cleaner, they're greener, they produce far less waste. But countries like Germany, for example, have seen kind of what would happen in the result of one of these disasters and have pulled back. The scary part is that we're seeing kind of that push to answer your question is in more developing countries. And then we have to ask ourselves, you know, how much do we trust kind of what's happening there? And particularly if it's politically unstable. And we're seeing now how Russia is using these plants almost politically by setting up their military right outside the plants and things like that, talking about tactical nuclear weapons. So I think that's kind of the main concern. Certainly, they can be cleaner and more efficient, but the threat of disaster, I think, looms large. And the main concern I would have is in developing countries. You know, I feel more comfortable in the US, but certainly in other parts of the world, I'd be a little bit nervous. And of course, there's always things that we don't consider, right? We don't think about tsunamis. We don't think about human error. And certainly we never thought about a war, right? They said that, you know, 50% of the nuclear power in Ukraine is coming from nuclear power plants, but they're using now a VVER reactor, which solves some of the problems that I highlighted before from the RBKM reactor. But never did they think that we'd be in this position now, where shelling is happening right outside where the armies are storing ammunition. So some of the stuff is unpredictable. And when we think about like a cesium-137 half-life, right? Imagine if something does happen, you make these areas uninhabitable, you know, for centuries. So you have to ask if it's worth the risk. And I would ask those that, you know, that talk about it from a financial perspective, is it really worth that risk?
Thank you.
All right, we have a few questions in the chat here. So someone commented, you spoke about a group of older population remained in the affected area and the government allowed them to remain there. Why do you think they chose to stay? And do you think it should be compulsory for them to leave?
Well, a lot of them have been moved now because of what's happening with the war. But that exclusion zone after disaster, they were allowed to stay. They were there for quite a long time. And really the only reason is that they were very old. And that's kind of the truth of it. It was a small group of folks that stayed behind. There was some risk, right? Because if they're picking mushrooms, for example, and then taking it to the market, that could pose a risk. But the government knew that they were there and they were kind of closely monitored and they didn't want to displace them.
Thank you. And I have one more question. What does a crisis in Ukraine mean for the Chernobyl disaster, and what could be some consequences of disturbing the site?
Well, I think that we'll see. I think that although the army came in, they left. There was considerable looting there. There were many fires. There is some concern that the Russian army spent a lot of time in the Red Forest, which is, I think, highly contaminated. So we'll see what the results of that will be. But certainly it's put it back on the political stage, going back to an earlier question. And again, that plant has been decommissioned, but certainly there's still so much that we can learn, I think, from the original disaster, from the army coming in with that brief occupation, and now what's happening in Zaporizhia. It's incredibly scary. We're talking about a huge nuclear power plant here. And to the
Well,
GEH lab, to the Slava Ukrainia, say Heroyam Slava.
yes. Well, thank you again for that very impactful presentation, and thank you for all the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hochok.
Thank you, everyone.
And so we'll keep moving. And so next we have Miss Katrina Jacoby. She is a professional presenter. She is a project manager of NPO hashtag We Ride Together. And today she'll be presenting on applying an ecological model of health behavior to prevent sexual assault in youth sports with hashtag We Ride Together. Take it away, Miss Katrina.
All right, can everybody hear me, I'm hoping? I'm gonna try and share my screen so that we can see the presentation. All right. If anyone can just give me a thumbs up that we can see and hear what's happening. Perfect. All right. All right, hi guys. My name is Katrina Jacoby. I'm a former GH Lab intern and current program manager with We Ride Together, which was already mentioned. And as was mentioned, my presentation is applying an ecological model of health behavior to prevent sexual assault in youth sports. So I really want to let this quote sink in because it appears to sort of reflect the situation at hand in this country, which is the United States of America. It's from Marcy Hamilton, who's a child health and safety advocate. And it really signifies how we look at children, especially in sports. So just let that sort of prime your minds. All right, so what's the issue that we're addressing? We have an epidemic in this country. In America, there are 60 million child athletes, which is roughly 60% of the child population. And during the course of their athletic career, at least a quarter, usually more, of these kids experience sexual assault and abuse at the hands of trusted figures of authority in their sports, most often it being a coach, which is about 15 million kids. It's a lot of kids. And the kicker is that in this country, sexual abuse of a minor is not a federal crime. Crimes of this nature are dealt with on a state-by-state basis, except when the abuse has verifiably been conducted in 2 or more states, which is to say that a child in a single state could be abused 100 times and federal courts would not be involved. So in 2017, following several public scandals in sports, an organization called the U.S. Center for Safe Sport was created for all U.S. sanctioned Olympic athletic disciplines. They are the sole providers of training, education, reporting, and adjudicating abuse among child athletes. The health implications of abuse are really quite serious. Psychologically, victims may experience anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, panic attacks, disassociation, eating disorders, and PTSD. Physical effects include self-harm, weight fluctuations, drug use, sexually transmitted diseases, pregnancy, UTIs, and suicide. What has become more widely researched is the physiological effects that abuse has on its victims, even victims where their experiences have long passed. Research from several studies has indicated that in adults who were abused as children, the structures of their brain were significantly altered. These abnormalities were linked to symptoms like memory issues or epileptic-like patterns. So a little bit about We Ride Together. We Ride Together is a nonprofit aimed at preventing and stopping sexual abuse in horse sports, but in other youth sports. This organization began as a PSA and evolved into a 501c nonprofit working in all sports. The mission statement is to shine a light on the endemic issue of sexual abuse in youth sports, starting with equestrian sport and then broadening to every sport. Our mission is to make youth and amateur sport environments safer for all athletes. So their multi-pronged approach uses 3 core strategies. First is education for all young athletes, all athletic training programs, and families. Second is resources for victims and families. This can include guidance on what next steps might be after abuse has occurred, whether it be legal or otherwise, what the reporting process is like for victims and families, but also helping victims and families find appropriate means to cope and to heal. Finally, we also offer support for victims of sexual abuse, including the recipient, their families, but oftentimes even the families of the perpetrators, who are generally rather unaware of the problem that's happened. So I know the font is really rather small on this. I tried to make it as large as possible to fit. So if you guys have to squint, I'm sorry. But what this logic model does is summarize the efforts that our organization, We Ride Together, is making and what outcomes we hope to see, and it cites some of the barriers to change. Now, the major barriers that we combat are the societal, social, and cultural attitudes in sports when it comes to sexual abuse. It appears that the attitudes are exclusive to the athletic world, and they're rarely cited in cases of other power dynamics where the children are victims. Think teacher-student relations. Okay, so there are several common beliefs that act as barriers, as I already mentioned, in changing how the athletic community thinks about child sexual abuse. So I'll address the first couple a little more in depth, which is that child abuse can be consensual and that the victim knew what they were doing. So first and foremost, child sexual abuse can never be consensual in any way, shape, or form. Even signed witnessed consent between a minor and adult is non-binding in this country. It's a non-starter, it doesn't count. This next idea, it's a powerful rhetoric that the victims were somehow complicit, that they knew what they were doing, and in not coming forward initially, they forfeit the right to seek justice. Unfortunately, this is a rather common belief. There are actually numerous factors, though, as to why kids don't come forward during or after abuse. In sports, especially in elite sports, coaches have an extremely outsized place in the child's life, and this can make the kid more pliant and more willing right off the bat. Victims also know that they would be privy to a spectrum of feedback in speaking up. To quote an expert named Les Nichols, if they know they're going to accuse someone who's looked up to, they know that the community will resent them. In addition to this, it can also take a long time for a child to understand what's happened. Abusers will utilize behaviors such as grooming, in which children and families are manipulated to believe that the abuser is trustworthy and caring. Now, this can take place over years, even decades. So this window of opportunity for the abusers to sort of create their perfect environment is quite large. And when the abuse finally does occur, the victims are generally so conditioned to ally with their abuser and so trusting in their abuser that escaping or stopping the abuse can be incredibly difficult. It's also incredibly difficult for families or just other peers to even recognize what's happening. It's designed to look like a helpful act. Now, to address these other myths, the current rate of false accusations is incredibly low, roughly 2 to 4%, so that myth has very little basis. Also, in that following myth regarding the proclivities of certain victims, most often in abuse cases, nearly 100% of abuse cases, the abuse itself is the victim's first ever sexual act. So no, they're not more provocative or, perhaps more explicit sexually. Now, we've already covered the health impacts due to abuse rather extensively, but the final myth, which is that it only happens to females, is incorrect. Men, unfortunately, are abused just the same way women are abused. So this is sort of an outline of the model that we're going to be using for this presentation, which is going to help with the big picture thinking about abuse in sports. So this is that same model, just reworked to sort of incorporate We Ride Together. See, we know that programs are most likely to be effective when they're designed to address multiple levels of influence with health behaviors. And here we can see how We Ride Together does that. So at the individual level are the athletes themselves, and those are our target audience. And at the interpersonal level, we see coaches, teammates, families, and those who work directly around the athletes. We call those support staff. At the community level, which is where We Ride Together lives, along with several other organizations, such as Darkness to Light, Army of Survivors, etc. And on the societal level, we have the national governing bodies for sports, both internationally and nationally. So those are the organizations that, create competitions, create point systems, etc. So for individuals, We Ride Together really helps understand the behaviors associated with abuse, allow victims to understand where to go for help, and how to feel empowered in advocating for themselves. With the coaches, families, teammates, etc., We Ride Together really helps create safe environments. We help others learn how to identify abuse sort of on the outside view looking in, understand what abusive behaviors look like, what their indicators are, and what the effects are, and most importantly, how to foster the skills to effectively talk about abuse with each other and with the individual athletes. So where We Ride Together exists on this level is where we do the most of our work, which is to promote our safe practice toolkits, which include safe sport pledges, give ideas on how to create safe environments for coaches and for families and for organizations. We also promote engagement with We Ride Together through events, social media, PSAs, giveaways, raffles, things like that. So we're constantly trying to get people engaged with our program and understanding as to what the message is. We also promote dialogue between individuals. Now, this can be dialogue from family to family, athletes with families, athletes with support staffs, every kind of dialogue you can imagine in the athletic discipline. We're a part of it, and we're trying to make sure that it's positive and healthy. We also facilitate communications between organizations. Now, organizations, unfortunately, in this arena tend to have very limited resources. So part of what our mission is to increase the resources by simply opening up those lines of communication so that we can all share as many resources as it is, whether it's financial, sometimes it's just social media reach, whatever it may be. Getting everybody on the same page is paramount. We also focus on generating accessible resources for education and reporting. Unfortunately, a lot of the issues surrounding abuse is that there's just not a lot of education on it. So we are trying to make our own individual, but also more widely used educational services like quick trainings or quick tips, just things that are easy to digest and remember that make a lasting impression. Overall, in each athletic discipline, what we want to do is change the attitudes about abuse, strengthen the associations and policies aimed at preventing abuse, expand the organizational resources for every kind of group, whether it be the athletes themselves, the families, or the other nonprofits and organizing bodies in the sports, with our overall goal of eliminating sexual abuse in sports. Unfortunately, I think that's a rather far off goal. This is a little bit about what We Ride Together has done using this model and a little bit of our progress, which is very exciting. So we began in 2021. And since then, we have officially become a 501c organization, which is a tax-deductible charitable organization. Yay. We've won 2 awards, both for web design and for our revolutionary one-of-a-kind public service announcements. We've also created a toolkit of best practices for athletes and coaches, which includes, like I said, best practices, including how to create safe environments, promote dialogue, and pledges between athletes and coaches that solidify a safe, healthy relationship between the two parties. We've also partnered with numerous athletic organizations like the United States Olympic Committee, which is who's in charge of sending out all of our Olympic teams to international stages, which is very exciting. We've also opened up the partnerships with US Rowing, US Eventing Association, United States Hunter Jumper Association, Interscholastic Equestrian Association. All of those are equestrian sports based, in addition to the International Federation for Equestrian Sports. So we are solidly based in equestrian sports, but definitely starting to branch out, which is very exciting. We've also partnered with multiple media outlets, including, internet news sites, TV channels, ESPN reporters. We've also partnered with apparel retailers, competition-based enterprises, such as the companies that put on the horse shows or the athletic events, in addition to private businesses like photographers or videographers that are always a factor in the athletic world. Most recently, we've begun an accredited internship program for college athletes and sports supporters. Our most exciting achievement is that we've facilitated hundreds of survivors to speak about their experiences. Now, why does this matter? Obviously, we could say, okay, yeah, children matter, but most often with these businesses and with sports, we have to think a little more broad because people don't necessarily care about their athletes. They care about winning. And they care about what their country represents. And right now, whoops, there we go. Every athlete that the US sends into global competition acts as representatives of this country. They sort of embody who we are as a country, what we hope to, what we hope to say. So we have to think a little bit about who we're sending out into these global stages. Are we creating healthy citizens? Are we creating citizens that feel empowered and know how to help themselves and know how to help others? What do we want our athletes to really, really say? What is our message as a country? Is winning more important than our right that athletes, that every person has, to the highest attainable standard of health? Right now, our international athletes are a product of their environment. Oftentimes, they're battered and traumatized. With We Ride Together, we do hope to turn the tide and make our athletes healthier, stronger, and feel empowered to advocate for themselves and for others. This is the We Ride Together mantra, which is we hear you, we see you, we stand with you. We are the army of survivors, and we ride together. These are my references, and that about sums it up. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me here. It's great to be a part of this again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. That was an amazing presentation and a very much needed discussion that everyone needs to hear about and know about. So are there any questions?
All right, I see a couple in the chat. Let's see. Have you received pushback from certain populations or unexpected barriers? I know that many are hesitant to speak on sex and sexual health with children and students. How have you handled some of these barriers? Yes, we have. Every single time we think we, combat a new problem, we get a new one. Strangely enough, one of the largest barriers that we did not prepare for was parents of children. Every parent wants their child to be safe, but like your question sort of indicated, a lot of these parents don't even want to touch on this topic. They don't want to talk about sex. They don't want to talk about safe sex practices. They don't want to imagine that they're putting their child in an unsafe environment. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now is actually working with parents to sort of create messaging that they would be more receptive to. Some of the projects that we have going on that haven't quite launched are going to use those parental resources that we have. Some of the barriers in the past that we've definitely had to deal with is money. There's not a lot of money in this problem. Nobody wants to donate. If anything, there's actually a rival organization that deals with clearing the name of already convicted abusers that has gotten $4 million in donations just within the last 6 months. Yeah, so it's a little hard getting people to donate. That's definitely one of the larger barriers that one we did see coming. Any other questions? If not, then like I said, thanks for having
I
me.
have a question.
Yeah.
I was just curious how you guys build collaborations and work with some of the national organizations.
Yeah, so what's great is that a lot of these national organizations tend to have some kind of an ethics committee. And a lot of these organizations, they want training programs because right now they're using the organization Safe Sport, and that's a really lacking program just because, again, that's the organization doesn't have a lot of money. So they are super open to any kind of extra resources that they can get, especially this entire team of experts that there's 8 of us and all we've done is dedicate our time to this problem. Generally, all we have to do is reach out to a couple of the right people. So they tend to have, an outreach manager or a partnership. That's not the official title of who these people are, but people that deal with that exclusively. The fact that a lot of us are already in the athletic world, especially the equestrian world, we already sort of know who to go to. And if we don't know, then a lot of people that we know, they know who to go to. So it's a lot of using every possible, mean and method that we can get to contacting different organizations. Hope that answers your question.
I have a question. You mentioned that you help facilitate conversations and teach people how to have effective conversations on these topics. So like, what are like the three, I don't know, like 1, 2, maybe even like 3 basic tips or rules or guidelines on how to have an effective conversation on this?
Great question. One of the biggest tips that we have, and we do have a little checklist of how to have these conversations, is being calm and being open, creating as neutral an environment as possible. And that goes for the athletes, and that goes for the family or whoever's having these conversations. It's an incredibly inflammatory topic. It tends to leave people angry or uncomfortable. So making sure that everybody is in a calm and communicative headspace is absolutely the number one thing that we promote and that we encourage others to promote, because it's a non-starter if you try and have these conversations and people are so emotional that they can't even really let the information digest. Everybody has to feel like they're not fighting, you know? So that's one of our biggest tips. The second is definitely language, making sure that everyone's language is appropriate. There are certain terms that certain victims prefer. Certain victims, prefer the term survivor. Certain survivors prefer the term victims. It varies. So making sure that everybody that we reach out to does have the proper vocabulary, which we do have a little toolkit for that, like I said. I would say that the third is just having conversations to begin with. And I know that sounds fairly basic, but as we already said, a lot of people don't want to bring this up at all. And just giving people the environment, even a simple sentence such as, if you need anything, I'm here. Just getting started, just getting your foot in the door is already a huge, huge step that a lot of survivors and victims really, really, really need to hear.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? All right, well, Dr. Shiba, should we take a break or should we just keep going? 5-minute break? All right, 5-minute break, everyone. Meet you back in 5 minutes.